I was sitting across from my friend Elena last week, and honestly, she looked like she was vibrating at a frequency only dogs could hear. She had these deep violet shadows under her eyes. Her shoulders were, I mean, they were hiked up to her ears in this permanent state of tension. And she was nursing her third espresso while her phone just buzzed incessantly with, urgent family group chats and work pings. She told me she was exhausted, that her back had been aching for months and she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a full night's sleep. She was running on fumes, pure, unadulterated metabolic debt. But then I asked her how she was actually doing, and that's when it happened. Yeah. Her entire face just transformed. She beamed at me. Her eyes suddenly bright, and she said, "Honestly, I've never been more satisfied with my life. Everything feels so right. I feel so incredibly fulfilled." It was a total cognitive whiplash. I mean, if you looked at her stats, her cortisol levels, her sleep data, her physical pain, she was deep in the red. She was, by all objective measures, suffering. And yet her internal report was this glowing 5-star review. It felt like watching someone standing in a downpour, soaked to the bone and shivering, while just insistently describing the beautiful sunshine and how lucky they were to be outside. I couldn't stop thinking about that contradiction. Why would the human brain report maximum happiness exactly when the body is under maximum strain? Is that just denial? Resilience? Or is it something much, much more fundamental? And it turns out Elena isn't an outlier. She's a central data point in what researchers are now calling the 2025 happiness paradox. New longitudinal studies have uncovered this bizarre, highly gendered anomaly. While women are reporting higher levels of physiological stress and somatic pain than ever before, their life satisfaction scores are simultaneously skyrocketing, far, far outpacing men's scores. It feels like a glitch in our psychology, doesn't it? A massive error in our internal emotional accounting. But evolutionary biology suggests it's not a bug, it's a feature. We're looking at a deeply ancient survival algorithm, a sophisticated satisfaction module that's designed to pay us a psychological subsidy for enduring the high-stakes, high-stress work of building and maintaining crucial social safety nets. We aren't just happy, we're being strategically compensated for survival. And as the modern world pushes this ancient code to its breaking point, we have to ask, what happens when the stress is real, but the happiness reward is just an evolutionary illusion?
That framing it's exactly where we need to start. The idea of this paradox being a successful adaptive strategy.
Right.
Because you see that kind of massive dissonance between, objective physiological suffering and this high subjective well-being, the standard psychological models.
Yeah.
They just fail.
The ones that assume happiness is just the absence of pain.
They completely fall apart. So we have to turn to evolutionary theory to understand the function of this paradox. Yeah. We're accepting this data not as some kind of flaw in how we measure things, but as an adaptive strategy, one that's been highly conserved across human history.
So our mission today is to dig into that.
Our mission is to uncover the underlying biological and evolutionary mechanisms that allow high stress and high satisfaction to coexist. And we have to begin by understanding the immense evolutionary costs that are just baked into the female survival script. Why does the female nervous system seem so perpetually stressed in the first place?
That initial question, the why so stressed question, that really resonated with me when I was digging into the case studies. I read this one profile about a woman, Sarah, a high-level project manager in Boston.
Okay.
On paper, she's absolutely thriving, rates her life satisfaction an 8 out of 10, runs these massive, complex teams. But her physiological sensors in the study, they told a radically different story. Her cortisol levels were chronically elevated. Her heart rate variability suggested she was just perpetually hovering near a state of acute stress.
Wow. So her body was telling you a completely different story than her mind.
Completely. And she describes herself as naturally cautious, someone who mentally rehearses every single negative outcome. She told the researchers she triple checks the car seats, even though her children are teenagers. Right. And she anticipates every possible disaster at work, basically managing risk for an entire department before anyone else even sees the problem coming. From a purely functional perspective, she is just carrying this massive metabolic cost of hyper-vigilance.
And that's the key term, hyper-vigilance.
Yeah. And I look at Sarah and I realize she isn't just anxious in the modern clinical sense. She's running an ancient high-stakes survival program, one that prioritizes not failing to notice danger over feeling calm. It's an exhausting burden to carry. And, well, we need a framework to explain why evolution would select for such a draining strategy.
And the exhaustion you described with Sarah, that metabolic cost of hypervigilance, is the direct consequence of the evolutionary calculus we need to look at. We have to start by acknowledging that the traditional, the highly popularized model of stress, The fight or flight response.
Right.
It's often an inadequate or even a maladaptive description of what happens in the female body under threat.
Okay, let's unpack that. The fight or flight gap. Because I think most of us, myself included, always assumed stress was universal. You get sympathetic arousal, your heart pounds, adrenaline kicks in, and you either attack the threat or run from it. That's the textbook definition.
That textbook definition is accurate for the physiological core of stress mobilization, which is certainly universal. The sympathetic nervous system activates. You get that hormonal cascade of catecholamines, norepinephrine, and epideriderin that prepares the body for intense, immediate action.
But the behavior is different.
The behavioral response that follows is highly sex differentiated, particularly for females who have historically borne the disproportionate role in caring for very young, highly dependent offspring.
Right.
Just think about the evolutionary reality for a moment. If a female is pregnant or nursing or caring for immature children who can't flee on their own, choosing the canonical fight response could mean putting her vulnerable offspring directly into the path of danger.
And flight is no better.
Choosing flight would force her to abandon her children, which means the catastrophic loss of her genetic investment, or she'd have to carry them, which compromises her speed and agility, putting both her and the children in even greater jeopardy.
So those immediate aggressive behaviors we often associate with male stress responses, they have to be biologically inhibited in the female line because the evolutionary cost of flight or aggression, losing a dependent child, is just far too high in that context. It's actually an anti-survival strategy.
Precisely. The successful stress responses, the ones that got passed down, had to be the ones that protected the offspring and the self, or at the very least prioritized protecting the offspring long enough for them to escape or be hidden. And we see physiological evidence that supports this inhibition.
Like what?
Well, for instance, the female stress response doesn't show the same strong androgen links that we see in males. Androgens like testosterone are tied to higher levels of aggression, hostility, risk-taking in males. And testosterone levels have been shown to increase dramatically with acute stress in men, facilitating that fight component.
And since women largely lack those high androgen levels,
their aggressive responses tend to be tied less to that raw sympathetic arousal and more to very specific defensive situations, like maternal defense against an immediate threat to her young.
Or it's more indirect.
Or it manifests as indirect aggression.
Yeah.
Things like strategic gossip or rumor spreading, which is all aimed at preserving social standing and ostracizing defectors within the social group, which is crucial. It's not about physical conflict with the predator.
That's fascinating. So the stress mobilization still happens. The body is activated. It's preparing for a threat, but that immediate high-risk behavioral channel of fight or flight is biologically inhibited because of dependence. So where does all that raw, unreleased energy go?
It manifests as chronic, low-grade, simmering anxiety, the kind we saw in Sarah, the vibrating project manager.
Exactly.
And to understand why that anxiety, that constant low-grade stress is actually adaptive, we have to turn to error management theory, or EMT.
Okay.
EMT provides the foundation for female vigilance because it explains the decision-making bias that evolved under conditions of uncertainty.
So can you lay out EMT for us simply? What's the core principle here?
The core principle is that because the world is inherently uncertain and threats are often, really difficult to detect reliably, evolved cognitive mechanisms will be biased. They'll be biased toward making the less costly error.
The less costly error.
Right. You have two fundamental types of errors you can make when you're faced with uncertainty about a threat.
The famous type I and type 2 errors from statistics.
Yes, exactly. A type I error is a false positive. That means believing a threat is present when it's not. Think of an overly sensitive car alarm or a nuisance fire alarm.
You jump, your heart races, but it's nothing.
It's nothing. You spend energy, you feel panic, you investigate, but nothing is actually wrong. A type 2 error, on the other hand, is a false negative. That means failing to detect a threat when one is actually present. This is ignoring a real fire alarm because you thought it was just another glitch.
And this is where the evolutionary cost asymmetry just explodes, especially for ancestral females.
It is so crucial to grasp the scale of this difference. For a female, in the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, the cost of a type 2 error, that false negative, failing to detect a real catastrophic threat, whether it's a predator, a sudden resource scarcity, or a critical social betrayal that leads to ostracism.
It was everything.
It was evolutionarily existential. It could mean the immediate death of her offspring and the complete cessation of her entire genetic lineage. That cost is catastrophically, unrecoverably large.
But the cost of a type I error, the false positive.
Right.
which manifests as chronic worry, checking the locks 5 times, spending hours on planning apps, or always anticipating disaster like we saw with Sarah.
That's just metabolic.
It's just metabolic. It's an energetic expense. It's exhausting. It causes physical pain. It drains your cortisol reserves, but it is not immediately fatal.
The adaptive calculus is just ruthlessly clear. Prioritizing existential survival always outweighs metabolic efficiency. And therefore, the female neurocognitive system is tuned like a hypersensitive smoke detector. This is the smoke detector principle, or SDP, in action.
So the system is calibrated to err overwhelmingly on the side of caution.
Overwhelmingly. If responding to a potential threat costs, say, 100 calories, but failing to respond to a real low-probability threat costs 10,000 calories in fitness terms, then fitness is maximized by expressing a threat response, anxiety, vigilance, mobilization, whenever the estimated probability of danger is greater than, say, 1%.
1%. That means 99% of those responses are, statistically speaking, false alarms. They're nuisance alarms, or what we call anxiety and stress today. And yet those false alarms aren't malfunctions. They're an inherent, necessary consequence of an optimally regulated defensive system. That's a powerful reframing.
And resolves the first half of our paradox, the chronic low-grade anxiety and physiological stress we see in modern data sets. They are the functional echo of this conserved adaptive calculus. It is an ancient survival script that consciously and successfully prioritizes not dying over feeling calm.
And this explains the objective physiological suffering, the high cortisol and the physical tension that Elena and Sarah were showing. It's the ongoing, expensive metabolic debt of running a highly effective, hypersensitive threat detection system. Okay. We've established the high-stress side of the paradox. Women are running this expensive essential vigilance program, which generates persistent negative affective states, that constant sense that something is about to go wrong, creating real biological strain. Now we have the massive task of figuring out how they are simultaneously reporting soaring, genuine life satisfaction. If the body is running in the red, where does the subjective sunshine come from? It has to be a biological reward mechanism strong enough to justify running that expensive stress script.
And that brings us directly to the strategic compensation strategy, the evolved solution to managing this immense chronic biological strain. The solution is the creation and maintenance of a social safety net, and the specialized neurochemical rewards that are associated with successful social bonding.
I found the case study of Maria particularly compelling here. I was scrolling through a series of video interviews from the study's qualitative archives, and I came across her story. Maria lives in a tight-knit community where she's essentially the social glue.
The organizer.
Totally. The person everyone calls for help, for advice, who organizes the meals when someone is sick. She looked, frankly, exhausted in her interview, but she kept insisting with this genuine, undeniable warmth that her life was blessed and deeply fulfilling.
The same pattern as Elena.
Exactly the same. And it struck me that her happiness wasn't just a mood, it was a strategy. Maintaining those complex social networks, that whole web of cooperative bonds and reciprocal altruism that keeps a tribe or a community alive, that's incredibly expensive. In terms of time, emotional energy, resources, evolution couldn't just leave that critical labor to chance.
So the happiness is the payment.
Maria's happiness, therefore, has to be a strategic cognitive reward. An internal currency her brain pays her so she doesn't stop doing the hard, exhausting work of social bonding. Her high satisfaction is the incentive that counterbalances her low biological well-being. When I watched her, I realized her brain is essentially subsidizing her physiological stress with a massive, targeted hit of meaning and fulfillment, so she keeps investing in others. It's a brilliant survival strategy, but it's just crucial to recognize that invisible toll. We see the smile and the 5-star satisfaction, but we often ignore the chronic biological debt being accrued in the background.
That concept of an internal currency, the strategic cognitive reward, is the absolute key to resolving this paradox, because the fight or flight response, as we discussed, is often maladaptive for females under threat. So an alternative biobehavioral response evolved that maximizes social defense. It's called tend and befriend.
Tend and befriend, that's the social solution to the physical limitations imposed by dependency.
Exactly. This strategy has 2 complementary components. Tending involves behaviors that actively protect and quiet offspring, retrieving them, soothing them, removing them from immediate harm, all of which increases survival likelihood.
And befriending?
Befriending involves affiliation with other social groups or individuals to create these extensive networks of association. These alliances reduce individual vulnerability, they allow for shared resources, and they effectively hedge against individual or localized calamity.
So if the vigilance system, the smoke detector principle, is constantly sounding that exhausting type I error alarm, that chronic anxiety, the social system has to kick in a reward to keep the organism from burning out, or worse, from disengaging from the group entirely. If the work is hard, the payment has to be good. So how does this tending and befriending translate biologically into that feeling of deep satisfaction Maria described?
It relies on a very distinct and powerful neuroendocrine basis. It's mediated primarily by the release of oxytocin and the activation of endogenous opioid mechanisms.
The feel-good chemical.
Precisely. Oxytocin plays a central, well-documented role in affiliation, social memory, pair bonding, caregiving behavior. When a female engages in tending or befriending behaviors under stress, oxytocin is released. And this release actively serves to downregulate the primary physiological stress responses.
Wait, you said downregulating the stress response. Can we pause on that? Specifically, you mentioned the HPA axis. For listeners who aren't steeped in endocrinology, what exactly is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and why is downregulating it so crucial for long-term female survival?
That's a critical point. The HPA axis is basically the central command structure for our stress response. When the brain perceives a threat, the hypothalamus detects the danger. It signals the pituitary gland, which in turn signals the adrenal glands to flood the body with glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol.
The main stress hormone.
The main one, yes. And cortisol is essential for mobilizing energy reserves for fight or flight. But chronically high levels, what we saw in Elena and Sarah, are toxic. They lead to muscle wasting, immune suppression, cardiovascular damage. It's just devastating over the long term.
So the high stress, the hypervigilance, is triggering that cortisol fire hose.
Precisely. And that's where the tend and befriend system provides this compensatory adaptive relief. The release of oxytocin acts as a powerful biological counterbalance to that cortisol surge.
How powerful.
We have studies that show higher levels of oxytocin are directly associated with reduced cortisol responses to stress and faster HPA recovery. When women engage in affiliative behavior nurturing, hugging, seeking support under duress, the oxytocin system activates, and it literally calms the organism. It reduces heart rate, and it blunts the intensity of the cortisol response.
So the subjective feeling of satisfaction and fulfillment, it's the cognitive wrapper around an essential biochemical process designed to prevent burnout and death from chronic stress. It's a mechanism that forces the body to prioritize the long-term strategic benefit of the social network over the immediate metabolic cost.
It is a critical survival feedback loop. This isn't just about feeling nice. This is about establishing strategic, defensive architecture. The social bonds that Maria cultivated are best understood through the lens of reciprocal altruism.
Reciprocal altruism. I help you now, you help me later. But why does this defensive architecture need such a massive internal reward? Couldn't evolution just make the need for the group purely utilitarian, cold and calculating?
Because group dynamics are messy. They're filled with risk, with cheaters, with defectors. These reciprocal altruism networks function as complex risk-pooling mechanisms. You can think of them as a kind of distributed biological insurance policy.
I like that.
By investing in reliable long-term alliances, sharing labor, cooperating on childcare, sharing information, pooling food females, create a social safety net that is absolutely essential for maximizing inclusive fitness. That is, the survival and reproductive success of yourself and your kin.
So the emotions are the software running the insurance policy.
That's a perfect analogy. The complex emotional systems, empathy, loyalty, trust, and crucially, satisfaction, are the software that maintain this defensive coalition. This software ensures that cooperators are rewarded and defectors are detected and sanctioned. Without that deep internal reward that says this bond is succeeding, the individual might choose the easier, low-energy path of isolation, which would be catastrophically dangerous in the ancestral environment.
And that brings us back to the cognitive reward itself. We can now analyze the strategic calibration of that reward. So the cognitive assessment of life satisfaction is not, as many of us assume, a passive measurement of hedonic pleasure.
That's correct. It is a highly sensitive strategic cognitive module, and it's integrating two main streams of input. First, you have that constant negative affective state generated by the vigilance system, the high stress and chronic anxiety.
And second?
Second, you have the positive neurochemical reward signal, the oxytocin and opioids, that are generated by successfully maintaining high-value, reliable social bonds.
So if the ancient vigilance circuit is the chronic cost, The successful maintenance of the social network is the strategic reward that offsets that cost. Satisfaction acts as an internal currency for survival labor.
We refer to this mechanism as the incentive subsidy. Satisfaction is the internal currency that motivates continued, persistent investment in the metabolically expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining work of building and sustaining that social safety net. It ensures the individual remains committed to the group strategy despite the personal toll.
Wow.
The paradox is completely resolved. The high satisfaction is the evolved payment for enduring the high stress, and this ensures the long-term propagation of the group's survival architecture. It's an internal mechanism that essentially tells the individual, yes, you are exhausted, but you are successfully executing the high-risk, high-reward strategy that will ensure long-term survival for your lineage.
It makes the observation that women report higher satisfaction scores not a sign of denial, but a sign of successful execution of their most vital long-term evolutionary strategy. That is truly profound.
And this leads us to the crucial discussion of just how robust and historically essential these female networks have been. And it really challenges many of the previous overly male-centric models of human sociality.
Yeah, let's get into that. Because when we talk about human evolution and cooperation, the popular traditional narrative has often been dominated by images of male alliances, male hunting parties, male warfare driving social structure.
Right, the man-the-hunter model.
Exactly. And this often leads to an implicit or even explicit assumption that female cooperation is secondary or less strategically important. But a deep dive into the cross-cultural and ethnographic evidence, it really necessitates a serious correction.
It fundamentally challenges those misconceptions. The assumption that humans were primarily male, philopatric meaning women, disposed at maturity to join new groups, while men stay put and form strong, permanent alliances, is simply not universally supported.
So it's not the default setting.
Not at all. Empirical studies in small-scale societies show human dispersal is highly variable and flexible. In many societies, both sexes migrate or both sexes stay. The human strategy is adaptable. What is constant is the dependence on social bonds for survival.
And focusing so narrowly on hunting, the traditionally male domain, it misses the critical bottom-line economic contribution of women that necessitated this cooperation in the first place.
Absolutely. Hunting often provides essential fat and protein, but its reliability is often, it's highly variable. It's boom and bust. Ethnographic records from diverse groups, from the Savannah Pume hunter-gatherers in Venezuela to Aboriginal Australian women, show that women and girls often forage in groups, providing the reliable, daily, bottom-line calories to their families.
A steady income, basically.
Like steady income. And the work itself often demands cooperation. Gathering small game, collecting roots, managing foraging implements. It's frequently done collectively. In fact, among many hunter-gatherers, it is often the men who tend to forage alone, while women gather collectively, reinforcing that female cooperative structure on a daily basis.
So cooperation is the norm, and it extends far beyond immediate kin because the collective task load is just so massive. I know the source material highlights that female sociality is a kind of defensive architecture designed to solve the challenges of human life history.
That is the core driver. The cooperation mechanisms are highly diverse and strategic. You have pooling resources, sharing labor, forming coalitions, and crucially, collective childcare, which we call allo-mothering.
Right.
The human condition compared to other primates presents a unique and incredibly demanding life history profile. We have short birth intervals, and our children are altricial, they're born immature, and require these prolonged, overlapping periods of intensive dependency. A human mother is often simultaneously pregnant, nursing an infant, and caring for a toddler and a pre-adolescent, all of whom are dependent on her time and energy.
That just sounds like an impossible time allocation problem.
It is. The mother alone simply cannot meet the immense metabolic demands of human reproduction, while also effectively foraging for the calories necessary to sustain herself. This necessity for cooperative assistance, primarily from daughters, sisters, mothers, grandmothers, is essential to solve the mother's time allocation problem. The assistance provided through allo-mothering essentially buys the mother time. It allows her to increase her fertility, reduce the intervals between births, and ensure higher survival rates for all her offspring.
That makes the female network not just a preference, but maybe the most critical evolutionary innovation for Homo sapiens reproduction. Can you give us some specific real-world examples of how this pooling and cooperation plays out in different societies?
We see patterns of shared food and shared labor globally. For example, among the Savannah Pume, girls play and work cooperatively from a very young age. They're often foraging and cooking together. And the food they gather is pooled and then shared out to family and non-family group members, which demonstrates this broad reciprocal aid, the foundation of the safety net.
And it's not just about food?
Not at all. In Aboriginal Australia, women often work collectively when collecting challenging resources, like certain roots or shellfish, or when the task involves a collective work implement, like managing a fire drive to flush out game.
And the social cohesion in these groups is robust enough to act as a defense mechanism, even against threats coming from within the group.
Absolutely. Female coalitions are often assumed to be weak or solely focused on kinship, but there are notable ethnographic exceptions where women cooperate very effectively to intervene against male aggression or to enforce group norms.
Really?
Yes. Among the Garifuna people, neighbors will assist women against male aggression. The Marakwet women in Kenya are described as clubbing together to chastise and even beat verbally and physically husbands who have harmed their wives. The solidarity and enforcement mechanisms are real. These female bonds function as a protective collective that ensures individual survival within a high-risk social landscape.
Which leads us squarely into the modern context, where the functional superiority and the measurable health benefits of this female-centric support system, they persist, even though the threats have shifted from lions to deadlines.
And research in health psychology confirms these measurable benefits. First, women are empirically more skilled than men at offering social support. This isn't a subjective observation. Studies show women are better at calibrating their support to the recipient's fluctuating needs.
What does that calibration look like in the data? How do they measure that?
Well, studies show that women provide more targeted, high-quality support, specifically on days when the recipient reports high stress. They are dynamically adjusting their investment based on acute need. In contrast, men's support provision tends to be less calibrated to the recipient's immediate stress level.
That's fascinating.
And what's more, women who are themselves under moderate stress still tend to maintain a high level of support quality for close others, whereas the quality of men's support often declines significantly as their own stress increases. The imperative to maintain the network seems to sort of transcend personal strain, at least in the short term.
And women also disproportionately seek out this calibrated support when they're stressed, which provides a direct physiological benefit.
They do, and they benefit tangibly. When women are receiving social support from friends, partners, or family, they show attenuated physiological and psychological responses to laboratory stress tasks. We see lower heart rate reactivity, we see reduced cortisol reactivity compared to women receiving no support or men receiving support.
And the physical component is key too, right?
It is. As we discussed with the neuroendocrinology, positive physical contact, like touching or hugging, produces more favorable, effective, and cardiovascular effects in females than in males under stress. It reinforces that oxytocin-mediated link.
So, if the social network is the strategic, protective solution to the chronic threat vigilance, then social isolation becomes the ultimate failure state.
It is the catastrophic failure state. It's the modern type 2 error for the social system. Studies show women are profoundly more sensitive to social isolation or low social support compared to men. They report higher levels of loneliness across age groups, especially when measuring subjective feelings of being misunderstood or disconnected.
And there's a biological marker for that sensitivity.
There is. Crucially, women show a significantly stronger cortisol stress reactivity when facing social failure or rejection than when facing achievement failure or task completion failure.
So they're reacting more strongly to the loss of the safety net than to the failure of the individual task.
Exactly. The absence of strong, reliable social ties is uniquely detrimental to women's physical and psychological health. It just reinforces the theory that the social network is not a mere preference or a leisure activity. It's a core, non-negotiable component of their evolutionary survival architecture. And this is why the reward for maintaining it has to be so intense, that feeling of high satisfaction.
This all sounds like a system that was perfectly evolved for an ancient world of small, stable groups where a face-to-face interaction guaranteed verifiable reciprocal aid. But what happens when we port that perfectly evolved algorithm into the digital, hyper-connected, yet often anonymous and transactional environment of 2025?
That is the central destabilizing threat to the happiness paradox. It leads us directly to the concept of the evolutionary mismatch.
I've been seeing the fallout of this mismatch in the data from the younger participants. Like this one young woman, Chloe, who is 22. Chloe is ostensibly more connected than any woman in history.
Right. Thousands of followers, constant interaction.
Exactly. She has thousands of digital interactions, her phone is buzzing with likes, and she's constantly socializing in virtual spaces. Yet her objective physiological markers are terrible. She's in a state of high stress, just like Elena and Sarah, but she does not report the same high life satisfaction that the older generations do.
Her paradox is collapsing.
It's completely collapsing. Her brain is still running the hyper-vigilant script, but the reward system isn't engaging. And why? Because there's this massive evolutionary mismatch happening. Our biology is tuned for deep bond social defense, the kind of physical presence where you can share resources, see the micro expressions of a trusted ally, and feel the physical touch that releases oxytocin.
Her brain is looking for a physical safety net.
It's looking for a tangible safety net of physical bodies, but all it's getting is the shallow, low-quality digital substitute. She mentioned feeling lonely in a crowd of notifications. This is where that strategic compensation fails. Without the genuine ancestral-level bond, the verifiable reciprocal altruism, the satisfaction subsidy doesn't fully kick in. It leaves only the chronic stress and hypervigilance without the necessary reward. It's a sobering thought.
Chloe's experience perfectly illustrates this collision between our ancestral machinery and the modern environment. The female neurocognitive system is tuned for what we call deep bond social defense. That means small, stable groups, where reciprocal aid is verifiable over time, where physical presence enables that critical oxytocin-mediated relaxation, and where alliance stability is high.
And the modern environment offers what looks like sociality, constant notifications, high visibility, but is often just a low-quality transactional substitute.
Yeah.
It feels like connection, but it doesn't function as a survival mechanism.
It provides shallow, transactional, mini interactions, often via digital means. And the key here is the decoupling. The high-stress component, the hypervigilance from error management theory, is still fully triggered. Modern threats like financial insecurity, social media scrutiny, generalized global uncertainty, all of these activate those ancient worry circuits that were designed to detect predators and social betrayal.
But if the social interactions that follow those triggers are digital and low quality, if the network doesn't provide verifiable risk pooling, if it's based on performance rather than loyalty, the brain doesn't register the successful maintenance of the safety net.
That's correct. The satisfaction subsidy, that crucial neurochemical reward signal for building genuine reciprocal altruism, it fails to kick in effectively. The system is left experiencing the chronic stress and hypervigilance without the evolved reward that historically justified the massive metabolic cost.
And that leads directly to the collapse.
It leads directly to the collapse of the paradox and the steep decline in subjective well-being that we are beginning to see in younger cohorts who rely predominantly on digital affiliation. It's maximum metabolic cost without the crucial cognitive compensation.
It's a tragic scenario. It reminds us that our brain is still operating on Pleistocene rules, regardless of our technological environment, and that we can't expect our ancient biological systems to feel satisfied by pixels when they were built for people.
And it's important to briefly note here that while the core need for a strong social network is universal, the specific strategy for seeking and utilizing support can be highly culturally flexible.
That's a great point. When we compare individualistic cultures, like in the US versus collectivistic cultures, like in many Asian societies, the method for achieving that safety net changes significantly.
Right.
In the US, where independence and self-expression are valued, women often rely heavily on explicit emotional support and self-disclosure to manage stress. They're actively engaging the tend and befriend system verbally.
But in collectivistic cultures, there is a strong imperative to maintain relational harmony and to avoid burdening others, because social harmony is a defensive mechanism in itself. So explicit requests for emotional support are often culturally avoided.
So how does it work there?
In those contexts, women benefit more from implicit or instrumental support, simply recognizing the presence of support of others or receiving help without asking. That's enough to reinforce the sense of the safety net without disrupting the necessary harmony.
So the evolutionary goal is the same, maintaining the defensive network and achieving that strategic reward. But the culturally appropriate method for activating the reward system differs. Regardless of whether the support is explicit or implicit, instrumental or emotional, the reliance on a strong, reliable social network remains fundamentally crucial for women across all cultures. The system must be maintained to achieve the strategic reward, or the paradox collapses.
To synthesize what we've discussed, the 2025 happiness paradox is ultimately resolved when we stop viewing female happiness as a simple statement about hedonic comfort or the absence of stress. Instead, we have to recognize it as a successful strategic biological function. The vigilance system generates persistent, high stress, the massive cost, because failure is existential. But the evolved social architecture ensures this cost is offset by the strategic, oxytocin, and opioid-mediated reward of subjective satisfaction. This incentive subsidy motivates the ongoing, metabolically expensive work of building and maintaining a genuine, high-quality social safety net, which maximizes long-term inclusive fitness.
The lesson here is profound, and it brings us right back to Elena, my friend who looked simultaneously exhausted and fulfilled. Her exhaustion was real, the metabolic cost of the hypervigilance necessary for survival, and her satisfaction was also real, the biological payment for successfully maintaining the network that makes that survival possible. That internal sense of satisfaction is a powerful, yet increasingly fragile, evolutionary mechanism. It's critical for us to recognize the real biological debt being accrued by chronic hypervigilance and, especially in this digitally saturated world, to ensure that the connections we invest in the workplace, at home, and in our communities are not merely transactional or digital illusions. They have to provide the genuine, ancestral-level reciprocal altruism that our deep bond social defense machinery requires to kick in that essential life-sustaining reward.